Good afternoon, Fort Collins. Once again, you are listening to 90.5 KCSU FM. I'm Rachel Mason, and this is Science CSU, your radio laboratory. Today I'm actually sitting in studio with Carmel Alpha. She is an undergraduate student here at CSU, completing her honors thesis. So welcome, Carmel.
Thank you for having me.
Good to have you here. So just to kind of start off, why don't you give us a little bit of background on yourself and how you kind of came to be at CSU?
Well, I grew up in Western Colorado in Grand Junction area and came to CSU because I love Fort Collins and it's a great school to go to. And I didn't really know what I was going to go into when I first came to CSU as a freshman, but I started off kind of changing my mind a few times. Finally figured out my niche in psychology, and once I was in those classes, I really realized that my specialization would be best if I specialized in industrial organizational psychology. So that's what I'm doing now. I graduate in May, and I'm hoping to go to grad school for industrial organizational psychology. I'm waiting to hear back from schools any day now.
Okay, very cool. And what schools are you applying to right now?
Kind of all over.
Yeah.
I've gotten one acceptance at Illinois Tech, and there's about 5 other ones that I'm waiting to hear back from, kind of all over the country.
Very cool. And so what got you interested in psychology, especially for your thesis?
Well, when I was first not really sure what I wanted to major in, my mom, she suggested psychology. I am the youngest of 3 girls, and my older 2 siblings, although they love each other very much, they, like most siblings, tended to fight sometimes. And I was usually always the kind of peacemaker between the two, kind of the diplomat. And so my mom really suggested, that would be a good niche for me. I have a natural tendency of trying to meander through situations to try and improve them and help people out working together. And once I was within the psychology world, I realized the counseling side, that kind of more touchy-feely side, was not necessarily for me, but I loved the combination of psychology and business that you find in industrial organizational psychology. So that was a really good fit for me. I have a business minor and a Spanish minor, and those just actually really seem to go together really well.
Okay. And so what does industrial psychology really encompass for those of us who might not know?
Yeah, it's a not super well-known field. It's some people like to say it's psychology for the business world. You bring together what you know from many areas in psychology and apply it to a business setting to make your employees work better together, to hire the correct people, to improve leadership abilities. It's most people who graduate with industrial organizational psychology, and once they've finished grad school, they usually are either in academia or as consultants.
Okay. And so kind of give us a summary of what you're looking at in your thesis and what you're kind of researching.
I'm looking at a thing called work engagement. It's defined as a positive, fulfilling, work-related state of mind that is characterized by vigor, dedication, and absorption. So that's kind of if you were to have a job that you do, and all of a sudden, while you're working, your time is just flying by, or you do that work just for the sake of doing the work, not the rewards you get from it, not money or the salary. Some people have described it as the harnessing of organization members' selves into their work roles, so how much you really put yourself into your work. And it's been proven to really increase employee productivity and decrease their absenteeism and increase customer loyalty. So it's very interesting for employers, and it's something that a lot of the psychology world is getting more and more interested in. I'm looking at a slightly different aspect of that research, and I'm looking at the differences in cultures and maybe what that relation is with work engagement. So we know that there's a lot of different factors that make up cultures, and I'm trying to harness those factors and see what kind of cultural work environments really increase or decrease perceived work engagement.
Okay. Have there ever been any studies on this particular aspect of the field that you know of?
Not that I know of. There has been quite a bit of research done on work engagement. A lot has been done by my thesis advisor, Dr. Burns, and there has been a lot of research done on what makes up different cultures. There's Hofstede in his 1980 article really looked at 4 different cultural components that make up a culture, and he has outlined several different areas in the world where each country falls on that spectrum of the 4 dimensions of culture. And so I guess I'm kind of combining both of those research areas, the cultural component and then the work engagement component.
And so how do these different areas or descriptions of culture that you said that each country or each culture fits on this spectrum, how does that relate to their engagement in their work?
Well, that's what I'm hoping to figure out.
Okay.
So there's those 4 dimensions I was talking about. They include individualistic versus collectivistic society, power distance, uncertainty avoidance, and a masculinity femininity cultural component. So each country can be labeled as high, medium, low. It's on a spectrum within those 4 dimensions. So, for example, the United States is an extremely highly individualistic culture, and we are extremely low power distance culture, kind of in the middle ground for uncertainty avoidance, and we're on the middle ground between a masculinity and femininity dimension.
So what is uncertainty avoidance?
That is how much a society as a whole tries to avoid uncertain situations. So really measures the tolerance a society has for ambiguity and the degree of need for having action to reduce uncertainty. So in a work setting, in a country that is high in uncertainty avoidance, they would want to diminish all those ambiguous situations. So in a work environment, they may have a lot of very strict and detailed rules. People would have higher levels of anxiety or aggression. They would really try and reduce uncertainty for their employees by establishing a lot of rules and regulations, and they really would view their career as a source of certainty and a source of insurance. So countries in that area the people would tend to try and hold a job longer just for the need to have that security.
And could you explain what the masculinity, femininity characteristic was?
Masculinity and the femininity are on opposite ends of that spectrum. A masculinity dimension would have the cultural norm as high levels of assertiveness, that need for acquisition of money and things, as well as low levels of caring for others, quality of life, or the people they're surrounded by. It can also, the masculinity dimension can also reflect the strengths of manager-subordinate relationships and the cooperation that is there versus a more task approach that you would find in a more femininity culture. And it would be more the concerns for the people around them.
How are you going about looking at this? How are you researching and kind of collecting your data?
Well, I am looking at some different samples. So my baseline, I wanted to collect data on the United States, giving surveys to the Psych 100 subject pool, and that would account for my United States population. But I am also trying to look at cultures that are the furthest away from the United States, the most different from the United States, and we were able to find quite a population of international students from Asian cultures and Middle East here at CSU. We wanted to look at CSU international students because with that way we wouldn't have to translate our test, which would create a lot of invalid scores. So we really wanted to keep it all in the same language. And so I was able to get in contact with the international office, and we're able to distribute my survey to some students from a specific region in the Middle East and specific countries in Asia. And that's a survey that includes a cultural component. So I actually test for those 4 dimensions of culture. And there's a work engagement component. The entire survey is 4 different tests included in it to try and really make sure that those cultural components are as we're hypothesizing. There is a concern that maybe this specific small portion of international students at CSU does not represent the same kind of cultural views as Hofstede had.
Right. Or that's kind of stereotyped
exactly
for that country.
Yeah, and so it's about a 30-minute test that includes 4 different subtests.
And so how did you go about structuring the questions on your survey to kind of test for these things without outright saying
yeah,
to kind of get the response you want?
Yeah, we actually were able to just use the original tests that have already been validated from other scientists. We could have tried to make our own tests, but we weren't really sure. It would have to be a lot more work into validating the test to make sure we're actually testing what we are saying we're going to test. And also for those portions of how do we ask them questions without outright telling them we are testing you for this,
Right.
So we were able to use other scientists' proven tests, and then all the response options are on a 1 to 5 scale. So there's a little deviance in how strongly each participant thinks the answer is.
You mentioned that your whole survey is made up of a few different tests. Could you kind of go into a little more detail of how each of those components are being tested, or how survey is kind of looking to people who are taking it?
So they would start out by seeing the Hofstede's 4-dimension questions. So they would see questions based off of the masculinity, femininity, the uncertainty avoidance, the power distance, and the individualistic collectivistic dimension. And each of those questions, once you know what it's asking, it's pretty obvious. Maybe questions for the power distance dimension would ask something like, I believe my boss is a person like me, he's easy to get in touch with, versus I don't think that I can easily talk to my boss, he's on a different pay scale than me, we have different levels in the company. So as someone who knows what that question's asking, it's pretty obvious. But as someone who doesn't know about those cultural dimensions, hopefully it's not too obvious.
Right.
But then after the cultural dimension, we're asking some questions on your work engagement points of view. So it would ask questions like, while at work, I am completely absorbed in my work and time flies. Or after a day at my work, I'm completely exhausted and I dread going back to work. Those would be kind of those two opposite sides.
So, you mentioned that you kind of distributed your survey to a baseline of U.S. students, as well as that you got a hold of the international student office. Do you know how big of a sample are you looking at as far as how many surveys?
Well, the absolute maximum would be about 550, but that's if we get maximum participation. We're hoping for 100 recruits from the Psych 100 pool, and then from that it kind of varies on how many students are here at CSU from the different countries we chose. We're looking at approximately 250 students from China, approximately 35 from Vietnam, 26 from Kuwait, 26 from Oman, and 130 from Saudi Arabia approximately. So if we do get full participation from those international students, we'll have a really awesome large sample. Right now, the concern is just that there is no incentive for the international students, opposed to the Psych 100 students. They get credit for participating, but we're just kind of asking the international group if they will participate, and it's up to them. So hopefully we get a good turnout with that.
So how long is your survey out there? Did you just distribute it recently, or?
Yeah, just a few days ago.
Okay.
So yeah, I know I was checking on it just the other day, and we already have quite a few respondents. But yeah, we're gonna keep it open for about 2 weeks.
Okay. So do you have any guesses as to what your results might look like based on what you already know of these cultural norms?
Well, we are hoping that the data will show, first of all, just large differences between the 3 different cultural groups. My hypothesis is that the United States will show a higher perceived work engagement. And this is all perceived work engagement, so there's self-report,
Right,
So,
so it's kind of biased.
Yeah, it is. And there is even talk that the questions themselves are not culturally sensitive to each culture and how they tend to respond. So there's always that to consider. But we are hypothesizing that the United States will have a higher perceived work engagement because of factors like us being a high individualistic culture. We would have a higher tendency of thinking that I am very important in my work. So yes, I perceive that I am very engaged. I perceive that this work that I do, that I really have as an identifier of myself, really is a huge, I am very engaged in that. Also, the United States having higher levels of masculinity dimension, they would expect to show high levels of engagement because they really have that need to achieve and that need for the more nominal rewards. So we're hypothesizing that the U.S. will be higher, but also the Asian and Middle Eastern cultures, because of their cultural dimensions, they're really hypothesized to be lower. For example, a lot of Asian cultures, they have a very collectivistic society, so they believe we as a whole can succeed, we as a whole can do this job great, just because from an early age they've always been taught, family and community values. And so when they're being asked, do you feel like you are engaged at work? Do you feel like you really put all your energy into this job? They probably do maybe just the same as the United States, but they're going to perceive that as being no, as a community or as the workforce, we really can do very well in this. And there's similar trends for the Middle East, but in different dimensions. They have really high levels of uncertainty avoidance. There's a lower tolerance for ambiguity, and so that may result in a perceived lower sense of engagement.
What would you ideally like to do with the results of your study? Do you want to see them kind of implemented in how employers cater to all of their employees to make sure that everyone is engaged?
Yeah, I think if something shows up, and as I hypothesize, I think it's really going to help companies in all different industries because our business world is so global that knowing how to increase your bottom line and increase customer loyalty, even if that's abroad somewhere, that these different benefits we see from work engagement will be extremely helpful for employers to know how to really get their employees to be more engaged in their work to ultimately increase the bottom line of their company. So I think the results of being engaged in your work is really beneficial for the employee themselves, but as an organization's point of view, it would also help them greatly.
Right. And do you know of any companies that are currently doing this, trying to kind of help cater to all the different cultures that are working for them, if that is the case?
I don't know of any specifically. I'm sure there are.
To me, it seems like today, especially like you said, with everything's kind of going global now, and also just companies trying to be more diverse within themselves, that might be an issue trying to cater to everybody.
Yeah. I really don't know of any companies offhand, but I'm sure it is. The work engagement research is really, in the last 10 or 20 years, it's really exploded. And I'm sure it'll be a bigger field, definitely, because there really are so many benefits for the employee and the company, but I don't know of any specifically.
And so what do you think that employers can do to help engage all of their workers?
I think the best would be to really understand a culture, that the cultural background that employees come from, whether that be to help them feel more comfortable in their work environment, like we were talking about people from those uncertainty avoidance cultures that are high in uncertainty avoidance. If an employee is from one of those type cultures, they would feel most comfortable in a setting that has those very distinct rules in place, that they know exactly where they stand and what rules to follow, and to avoid those ambiguous situations. employers could even structure their job to better cater to that. Instead of having more of a free work description, work on your own time, you feel free, maybe having a little bit more structure in the job description, telling them what their job is, what their job is not. I think little things like that really could help employers cater to the cultural differences that we would see in these like global businesses.
Do you think that work relationships play a big role in that? Like bosses' relationships to their workers? Because you mentioned earlier that in these cultures that don't come from very individualistic societies, that they might not feel like their boss is accessible enough to talk to. Do you think that that might be part of the problem? And how do you think that that could be fixed?
Yeah. Well, one of those dimensions, the power distance dimension, really hits on that, where the extent that like a society thinks that that power institution is unequal to like where they stand. And I haven't thought about that, but I think that would be one of the hardest cultural differences to make up as an employer, trying to like fill that space.
Mm-hmm.
But
so do you think that companies should be closer within themselves, or?
Well, I guess, I don't know, as someone who was born and raised in America, I do think that, but that is also our cultural opinion, that there shouldn't be that huge gap in that. Yeah, there should be like the middleman, the bottom man, and the CEO should all be accessible. So from an American standpoint, yeah, I think that would be better. I think communication would be easier, and diversity in a workforce is definitely is really like beneficial to any company. Easier to have a lower power distance.
Do you think that that would be kind of hard to introduce into other cultures to solve the problem of this kind of differing in work engagement? Do you think that that might be beneficial for them to be able to access their bosses more, or not, because they've kind of grown up in in a sort of culture where you're not supposed to talk to your boss and they're kind of inaccessible?
I don't know. Once again, from an American standpoint, I think it would be. But I think if you were to like introduce that intervention into a company, it could be very uncomfortable for some people. Just from being like a subordinate or to being a superior, it would be kind of uncomfortable. But I think it would just increase the diversity within the company, and that's always been proven to be extremely helpful.
You keep mentioning that kind of the basis of your study of what you're looking at has to do with Hofstede's definitions of cultural dimensions. Why did you choose his definition specifically? Were there other definitions that you were looking at, or is his kind of the standard that everyone uses?
His is kind of the standard. It's a really validated study, and it really has been cited in many, many different articles when it comes to different cultural studies. And so he really had taken data from all over the world and really got some good samples that have been proven to hold true for so long. And after his study, then he was able to compile these 4 different dimensions. So yeah, I used the definitions he had created just because I think those are the most to the point, and because I'm relying on his article so much, I wanted to keep that consistent between his findings and his definitions of what each dimension was.
How will you go about analyzing all of your data once you have it? You said that you just distributed your survey, but do you kind of have a plan of how you're going to analyze it all?
Well, we're going to do an ANOVA test, which will really allow me to compare the group means to see if there is a significant difference in like the work engagement between all the country clusters. And the results, we're expecting them to show that there are significant mean differences between Asia, the Middle East, and the United States on levels of work engagement due to those cultural differences.
So after you get all of your results and everything, what's the next step? What are you going to do with those?
Well, I just got accepted to present my thesis at the Rocky Mountain Psychological Association conference this April in Salt Lake City. So I'm excited about that. I'll be presenting a poster there. And then, of course, for the honors program, I have a big presentation at the beginning of May to really show all that I've done in the thesis and our final results.
Very cool. And do you know of any other people who are studying psychology, if they're kind of doing anything in this realm?
Not really in this realm. I have a few friends that are doing other projects in industrial organizational psychology, and some of their research sounds really cool. I'm helping one of my friends. He's looking at a virtual world study, so he's kind of working off the premise that in survival mode, humans, they make trust easier with other humans, and they make team building kind of things. So that's what team building exercise is based on in a workplace, is to try and build that trust between employees. And so what he's trying to show is if you could do team building and those trust exercises virtually through almost like a video game.
Okay.
So that's pretty cool. He has half of the subjects play a video game, essentially, and they have to work together to survive the night before, the monsters or something come. And the other half just have a peaceful condition where they can work with others. They don't have to. So he's hoping to find that virtual worlds do help people do team building and gain trust with each other. And that would have really cool implications in the business world, where if you have business partners in New York, Argentina, and China, instead of spending so much money to get them together to do a team building weekend,
Right.
they could just do it virtually through the internet.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think industrial organization is pretty cool.
That's very interesting. Coming to a close here, I know that you said that you'd like to go off to grad school and kind of continue your studies in psychology. What would be your dream job? Do you want to do any research, or?
I think I'm more interested in consulting. A lot of IO psychologists, they go into consulting, so you're paid by different companies to come in and do some kind of evaluation of your company, whether maybe they want interventions or they want a new system to hire new employees. So as a IO psychologist, you'd do an analysis of what the job entails, and then you would create the best selection system for that company. There's a lot more that they do, but yeah, that would be my dream job.
Very cool. Well, thanks for stepping into the studio and letting us interview you today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Nice to have you. So if you enjoyed what you heard, you can catch us every Sunday from 4 to 5 p.m. on 90.5 KCSU. Again, this is Science CSU, your radio laboratory. And we'll see you next time.